So I want to welcome everyone. My name is Rabbi Zach Truboff. This is our last session together in this series that has been titled The Postmodern Piety of Rav Shagar. We've been learning about Rav Shagar, an important Israeli religious Zionist thinker, profoundly creative thinker, one who combines between Torah, Gemara, Kabbalah, Hasidut, and postmodern secular thought, post-structuralist philosophy, bringing it together in unique ways. And what we've been focusing on in the course of these classes has been how Rav Shagar really grapples with the unique challenges of modernity. What does it mean to be a religious Jew, a passionate Jew, a pious Jew in a world that seems to negate the very possibility of that? And we've seen again how he approaches this in creative ways in different topics, how he conceives of faith, how he conceives of, faith that is not an illusion, how he conceives of a covenant, how he conceives of the way in which the religious language that we use helps shape our experience of the world. We've looked at the problem of suffering. We've looked at how he grapples with the question of ethics, as we saw last week, through the act of tzedakah. And today we're going to be looking at an appropriate topic, I suppose, for the last class, because it is the topic of messianism, of one's belief in the coming of the Messiah, of the redemption of the world. And it's appropriate for the last class because it's supposed to be Acharit Hayamim, at the end of days, right? The very end of history is when Mashiach is supposed to come, or that's what his coming symbolizes. So it's, again, appropriate for our last class here. And in a sense, too, with Pesach coming, again, Pesach is about the past redemption of the Jewish people, right? It establishes that moment in history where God took us out of Egypt, from slavery to freedom. But as we know, the whole emphasis of remembering the Pesach story isn't simply to remember past redemptions. It's not just to look back and say, well, that was a wonderful thing that happened to us. We want to remember that, right? The whole thrust of Pesach, particularly the Seder experience, is that we look at the past redemption in order to orient ourselves towards the future redemption, right? I think I might have mentioned this last week, but there's an idea in Chazal, right, that the bracha that we make before we recite Shemona Esrei is a bracha of Ga'al Yisrael, that we bless God for having redeemed us in the past from Egypt. But of course, we also include a blessing in Shemona Esrei for Geula of the present and future. Baruch atah Hashem Goel Yisrael, and the Chazal themselves say, B'sachar Brachot, we want to be Sonech Geula LeGeula. We want to always sort of hold together past redemption and future redemption. And of course, we end even just Shemona Esrei. The very last bracha of Shemona Esrei is the bracha of peace, right? This idea that we are looking forward to a time in which conflict and oppression in the world ends and human beings are able to live together in harmony. So it's an appropriate time of year as well to be looking forward to thinking to past redemption, but ultimately using that to look forward to the future redemption. So one of the things that we have to realize as it relates to Rav Shagar and the issue of redemption is that Rav Shagar is a religious Zionist, right? And if you're familiar at all with religious Zionism, we've touched upon this in previous sessions. One of its foundational beliefs, going back to Rav Kook, is that the Jewish return to the land of Israel heralds the beginning, or maybe the beginning of the Messianic era. This is Rav Kook's whole vision within his revolutionary approach to Torah, is that the Zionist enterprise, even in its primarily secular manifestation, can be seen as ushering in the process of redemption. And this, in many ways, is the bread and butter of religious Zionism, going back to the beginning of the state and certainly even very much through today. And if you grow up religious Zionist here in Israel, much of the religious language that is used, even in your educational experience and sort of what you'll hear in drashot, so to speak, is always to sort of hold in mind that we are either on the cusp of the Messianic era, or we are basically in it and waiting for it to fully unfold. That dominant vision, ethos of religious Zionism is something that Rav Shagar imbibed from his very youth. He's born in 1949. His parents are Holocaust survivors, but he is the first generation to grow up with the state of Israel as a living reality. He doesn't know life before the state of Israel. And for his generation and his parents' generation as well, right, there's a sense in which, especially in those early years of the state, that Israel is a miracle, right? That you cannot look at the War of Independence and come to any other conclusion that somehow the state of Israel's existence is an act of God. And this sensibility is particularly intensified in 1967 with the Six-Day War, right? What greater moment is there to prove the miraculous nature of Israel than its victory over the Arab armies that were much greater and ready to invade and perhaps wipe Israel off the map than the victory of the Six-Day War, where Israel not only survived, but soundly defeated all of its enemies and greatly expanded its borders and was able to reclaim many of its traditional holy sites. And one of the central things that happened after the Six-Day War, particularly for religious Zionism, was a profound intensification of messianic hope and expectations. Much of that tied in with the idea that the responsibility of the Jews, and particularly religious Zionists, is to go settle the Jewish heartland, Yehuda and Shomron, as a way of emphasizing, right, that this is what Mashiach is going to be all about. The Jewish people expressing connection to the land, expressing their sovereignty over the land, and this action, this political action, is going to be central to part of the unfolding process of redemption. This is the basic narrative. Now, what's striking, and this is perhaps unsurprising for us, we saw this already in our very first session, Rav Shagar's own experience during the Yom Kippur War, an experience that was, or can only be described as traumatic, right? He is unwilling to turn to the explanation of messianism as a way of solving all the problems. We saw Rav Amital. Rav Amital says, Yom Kippur looked horrible. Thousands of Jews died. We were caught unprepared. But don't look at that as in some way negating the messianic vision, right? It's just a speed bump. It's just an obstacle that we have to get around, and then we are moving full steam ahead to our messianic future. Rav Shagar was unwilling to look at the war that way. For him, the war presented, as we saw, questions without answers. And for much of Rav Shagar's adult life, what he struggles with is how to make sense of this belief, this messianic anticipation that fundamentally animates his being. He's something he's very passionate about, but at the same time, without falling into the trap in which messianism is used to actually deny the reality that is in front of us. And instead of being able to see reality as it is, right, too often it is the case that messianism causes one to live in a delusion or a fantasy. And for Rav Shagar, what he wants more than anything, as we've seen, is faith, emunah, breeds covenant that is not a fantasy, but tied to, binds us to something that is real. So what he is struck doing for much of his adult life is trying to rethink what does it mean to believe that the world is going to be redeemed? What does that mean in a way that can make sense to us? And what does it mean in a way that doesn't turn messianic beliefs into profound political dangers? So that's what we're going to look at today. Rav Shagar's rethinking of messianism. And in some ways, I think this topic may be his most creative and most significant, because for him, as he understands this as a religious Zionist, questions of messianism are not theoretical questions, right? Questions that we've seen up until now, to a certain extent, live in an abstract world of theology and theory. Messianism has real consequences, because depending on what you believe, right, it will directly shape what your political worldview is going to be as it relates to the state of Israel. So that's part of the reason why I think this topic is of particular importance, because it comes with stakes. There's real stakes to how you conceive about the nature of redemption, especially in this country. Right. One of the things that my chavrusa in yeshiva, one of my yeshivas I learned in, who grew up in Israel, I remember him telling me how one of the things that Americans have a hard time understanding about Israel, about the Middle East in general, is that Israel is a place where God is real. Right. Most of the world, most of the secular world, right? God is a name we invoke, a figure we imagine on occasion, but most of our lives, most of our society doesn't have to be structured around any kind of real belief in God. In Israel, you don't have a choice. God's real. In a certain sense, messianism is real, whether you like it or not. So you better learn to deal with it and understand it, because people are willing to stake their lives, and unfortunately, often the lives of others, on their beliefs in this area. So, as I said, I titled this session, "The Messy Business of Messianism." because there is no question Rav Shagar understands how messy it truly is. But what he also gets is that you can't have Judaism without it, right? There is, in some ways, if there are a fundamental principle of Judaism, if there are three, and I'll use Franz Rosenzweig for a moment as the paradigm, but I think it's one that Rav Shagar very much agrees with as well. There are three fundamental theological commitments of Judaism. It is creation, the idea that God created the world as an act of will, as a miracle in its own right, and therefore the world has a sense of intentionality on some level to it and purpose, even if we don't typically or necessarily experience it that way. All right. Number two, in Revelation, right, that God revealed God's self to the Jewish people, and of course, what we understand out of the process of revelation is the Torah, the covenant with the Jewish people, right? And then the third principle for Rosenzweig and for Rav Shagar absolutely as well is redemption, right? That these three fundamental theological principles are essential, and that redemption in many ways is the natural outcome of creation and revelation. Redemption is creation reaching its full purpose. Redemption is what revelation reveals us the possibility of, right? Revelation teaches us that there's a God and that God cares, and it points us to the possibility of what creation is ultimately supposed to look like. So redemption matters, right, for Jews. There are many things we can sort of say are negotiable when it comes to core theological beliefs or commitments. I'm not sure that redemption is one of them. So what I want to look at tonight are two essays by Rav Shagar, separated by about 15 years or so, and they are both connected to important historical political moments in the life of Israel. And Rav Shagar sees sort of the messianic underpinnings or resonances in each of these historical moments, and he uses them as opportunities to rethink what a hope or a belief in redemption is all about. One of the things that's very interesting about Rav Shagar is he does not hesitate to use political and historical events as a way of thinking through questions of Torah. And what I appreciate about Rav Shagar when he does this is that he is not looking to necessarily develop a concrete political vision through Torah. He's not like looking at policy questions and saying, okay, what does the Torah say about this? What he is doing is looking at dilemmas, looking at challenges, looking at like profound political historical contradictions and turning to the Torah to help make sense of them. Because what Rav Shagar recognizes is that the most profound political questions are always theological questions as well. And so he uses it as an opportunity to think theologically in a way that ultimately helps us understand the political reality as well. The first essay we're going to look at is an essay that he writes at the conclusion of the Gulf War. So we're talking 1990, 1991. And he uses it again to get at these issues of messianism. So what does the Gulf War have to do with messianism? Well, but here's what Rav Shagar reminds us. I mean, I was like in fifth grade, fourth grade for the Gulf War. But from the Israeli perspective, of course, right, the Gulf War was not something you just really watched on television, right? Americans, we watched it on television, right? Israelis, they experienced it from their bomb shelters. They experienced it with their gas masks on, potentially, right? So it was a war that wasn't just a television war, but something that directly impacted Jewish life here in Israel, right? The Scud missiles that came and landed here in Israel, right? It was a moment of great significance for Israel. And as is often the case with historical moments in which war and perhaps even global war looks imminent, was also a moment as seen as having messianic undertones to it. So Rav Shagar writes here, he says, the Gulf War was accompanied by a heaping dose of messianic apocalyptic decor, right? 1 million soldiers standing against each other, the worst destructive weapons in their hands, weapons of judgment day. As it says in Malachi, for behold, today a fiery furnace has come, right? There was something very profound about the military forces that were mobilized, right, to basically go to Iraq or Kuwait and basically take on Saddam Hussein. And the fact that it was a global affair in a sense, right? There was something very profound about it, the amount of soldiers, the amount of tanks, right? This was a moment of significance. And as I said, as often happens in these moments, right, people start sort of asking themselves, is there more going on here? Is this just another regional conflict or skirmish? Or could we be looking at something of much, much greater significance? And again, this happens almost any time there's a major war, right? Even when Russia invaded Ukraine, right? You might have heard whispers in the Jewish community, in certain sections of the Jewish community, as saying, well, wait a second, is this part of the unfolding events that will lead to redemption, right? If you look at some of the sections in the Nevi'im and in the Chazal as well, right, there's an apocalyptic dimension of redemption that assumes that part of redemption's unfolding process will be these wars, maybe even cataclysmic wars. So anytime you see this happening potentially, right, this sense of, is this the messianic moment comes to the fore. And Rav Shagar goes on to sort of try to understand, like, is there messianic potential here? What would that look like? How would we understand it? And here's what he says. Here's the conclusion that he ultimately comes to. He says, what does redemption mean for us? Like, how can this even be looked at as redemption or redemptive in any kind of way? And he even goes so far to say, does the new world order that President Bush is trying to lead have a messianic meaning? I mean, he actually gets into some of the political dynamics here, the global coalition. What is the world that America is trying to create? And he's asking himself, honestly, right, if you take redemption seriously, then you have to look at the world around you and ask yourself, are we getting closer to this? Is this historical development truly meaningful? And if America is trying to build a more globalized, peaceful, economically successful world, can we see that as part of the process of redemption coming? So here's what Rav Shagar says, because ultimately Rav Shagar, he is deeply concerned about trying to read redemption into history, into historical events, because he already knows from his experience in Israel that the moment you start trying to read redemption into historical, concrete, political events, right, it is very, very, very easy to be led astray. It is very, very easy to let your messianic hopes and expectations cause you to be convinced that the reality in front of you is something other than it is. And one of the things that Rav Shagar really tries to think through, and he's very much drawing on Hasidic thought, but we'll also see how he draws on important 20th century thinkers as well, philosophers as well, that redemption has to be understood less as a political historical moment of like, here's what it looks like, and more so as a state of consciousness, right? That redemption is about being able to cultivate a sense of messianic consciousness. This is ironic. This is something that was very big for the Lubavitcher Rebbe, who again saw himself and was seen by his followers as Mashiach. But if you let's use the Lubavitcher Rebbe as an example for a moment, right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe did not like seek to do right the way Rambam describes Mashiach. Mashiach is supposed to have an army. Mashiach is supposed to do all these concrete political things according to the Rambam and Hilchot Melachim, right? The Lubavitcher Rebbe didn't do that, right? Though he did, I'll point out. Anybody know what the kids group of Chabad is known as? Some of you probably spent time in it. What is it called? Anyway, you have to unmute.
The Tzivos, the army.
Tzivos Hashem, right? The army of God, right? So like that the kids group, the youth group, the Chabad youth group is called the army of God, right? So if the Rebbe's the head, right? The Rebbe's got his own army, right? But in truth, even if some people have actually pointed to that as an example of the Rebbe sort of trying to fulfill the key steps of the way the Rambam outlines the Mashiach, right? In truth, the Rebbe is very clear in his writings that redemption is about cultivating a certain kind of consciousness. That the political moment may help us be open to, but it is ultimately about us and not about the moment itself, right? The moment is at best sort of a catalyst for how we can potentially look at things differently. So I want to give you an example here how Rav Shagar gets at this, and we'll see how he continues to sort of develop this idea in later writings as well. He develops this based on Rav Simcha Bunim of Pshischa, great Polish Hasidic Rebbe, who explains it in the following way. He says, God the Almighty created the world and gave to all who are in it an order in which they will act. Right? God creates the world. He sets up the world according to certain rules, a certain order, certain way of being. And everything is going to fall according to those rules, to that system. And this is called nature, right? That's what nature is. We call it like the laws of nature. There's an order and a way in which the world works, right? That was what God set up in advance. And what's important to keep in mind when we refer to nature, right? It is, especially for Chassidut, right? It's an assumption of the way in which the world seems to operate without God's direct involvement, right? Nature is the sense in which the world is like autonomous. Right? There's just like rules that seem to operate without any divine hand, appearing through the clouds that basically enable the world to be what it is, right? And to keep working according to those rules, right? Again and again and again and again, seemingly forever. That's the way the world was created. However, Rav Simcha ben Abshischa also notes that this was only true until Avram Avinu, with him, the world behaved according to nature. But with Avram Avinu, it began to behave as a miracle, right? So what happens with Abraham? The world switches from nature to miracle. And this miraculous nature of the world continues until God gave the Jewish people the Torah, because all the plagues in Egypt and the tearing of the Red Sea, everything was done by miracle. That if you look at Jewish history from Abraham through the end of the Exodus, through the giving of the Torah at Har Sinai, it's like all one big miracle, or the world is constantly revealing its miraculous nature to us through the miracles that take place. However, when Israel sinned, the world returned to behaving according to nature, and all the miracles were forgotten, even though they themselves were still there, right? But when the Jewish people sinned, when the temple was destroyed, suddenly the miraculous nature of the world returned back to its more autonomous, self-governing sense, right? Where there's like a sort of a system in place that just sort of functions, according to set rules about how the way the world is ultimately supposed to be. But Rav Simcha ben Abshischa's point is that in a certain sense, the miraculous nature of the world is still there, but we don't experience it that way. We experience it as nature, as empty of God, as working according to autonomous ironclad rules. However, he continues here, since the world of miracles is above nature, and since they returned to the world of nature after the temple's destruction, the miracles were forgotten, and they had no memory. Nobody remembered them. Like us, that we have no memory of the aforementioned miracles, and in the future that will soon come in our time, the world of miracles will also be used. I mean, we're going to return back to seeing the world as miraculous, and you will see God's divinity and his government, his rule for all to see, right? So what Simcha ben Abshischa's point here is to a certain extent, like the world isn't going to change when redemption comes. What's going to change is that instead of us experiencing the world as nature, as sort of empty of God, working according to its own rules, we're going to finally recognize the miraculous nature of the world. And we're going to see that which we used to take for granted, right? Because we forgot miracles can really happen. And suddenly we're going to look at the world and see and recognize its fundamentally miraculous nature, right? This sort of goes to the point I was saying before about the relationship between revelation and redemption, right? Revelation is the miracle of God revealing God's self to human beings, to the world. Revelation is always a miracle. Redemption is the ability to recognize how the miracle of revelation is not like just a one-time moment, but actually sort of consists in an ongoing fashion. That the relationship between God and the world does not just appear to us like a bolt of lightning, but actually is constant and ongoing in some fashion. Right. So for what Rav Shagar likes about this text is, again, it puts the emphasis on messianism as not a historical political transformation. It's not that the world becomes perfect or the world becomes heaven or Gan Eden. It's that we actually see the miracle, the divine, the holy, the godly that exists within a world that normally we see as being empty of those things. Here's how Rav Shagar, continues here. He says, if so, the question of messianism becomes much more delicate, right? It's no longer a question of facts. It's not about looking at the historical political reality and saying, okay, have we checked enough boxes to say that redemption is here? As unusual as they may be, no matter how unusual the facts of the world are at the moment, or of miracles, in the language of Rav Simcha Bunim, but the question of our ability to treat what happens as a miracle. Meaning we're not debating, looking at events, looking at the 6-Day War and trying to debate, well, was it a miracle or was it not a miracle? Did it fulfill the certain requirements of a miracle such that it was something impossible and therefore we know it was truly miraculous? Or what Rav Shagar is really arguing here is that things that we could dismiss as not being miraculous, redemption is the ability to see the miraculous within them. And we know this all the time in a sense, right? So much of being religious are those moments where we no longer see the mundane as mundane, but we actually experience that there is something transcendent, something, beyond contained within it. But most of the time, we don't experience the moments that way. But when that moment that we've experienced it as mundane and banal suddenly cracks open to us and we see so much more within it, right? That is a moment of profound religious meaning and even redemptive meaning. And again, the question of our ability to treat what happens as a miracle as belonging to the world of the end of days, because that's what it means to see the divine or to experience the divine within the world in front of us. So what you're seeing here with Rav Shagar is a major, major shift, especially from the way religious Zionism typically functions, which is about seeing redemption as a concrete historical political reality to transitioning it towards a sense of like messianic consciousness. All right, that it's not that the world's different, it's that I am different. All right, and that in some ways is a much, much more radical change because the world changes all the time. Even dramatic things in the world happen all the time, in which changes that seem kind of impossible suddenly happen. But you know what always kind of looks the same over and over and over and over again over hundreds and thousands of years? Well, that's human beings, right? In some ways, it's more easy to imagine a miraculous change in the world as we know it than it is to imagine human beings actually being just a little bit different, to acting and thinking a little bit differently, right? That in some ways is the true miracle. And it's something that I would say Rav Shagar is sensitive to here. And again, for Rav Shagar, the concern is the way in which messianism translates itself into a political vision that is often profoundly dangerous. And he restates that again here. I just want to read this paragraph because I think it's very powerful the way he describes it. He says, not infrequently, our messianism turns from a utopian into an ideology, meaning messianism is about a belief in a better world or the possibility of a better world or the fundamental need for the world to be other than what it is. That is what messianism is based. That's what utopianism is at a basic level. But there's a way in which it becomes an ideology. And what Rav Shagar means by ideology is it means like a very concrete, again, political historical worldview. The redemption has to look a very specific kind of way. And it has to look a very specific kind of way because that's the way that I'm committed to based on the world that is in front of me right now. He says, I do not mean ideology in the simplistic sense in which Bloch perceives. He's talking about Ernst Bloch, a German Jewish early 20th century thinker, Marxist thinker, as a concept that is a tool of control, but ideology in the sense of a harsh concept that is neither attentive to reality nor to the person. Right? He's thinking about ideology in a way that somebody has a very concrete worldview that they can't get outside of, right? Probably the best way to understand ideology in the terms that Rav Shagar is describing it is to think of American political discourse today, right? Like again, if you're a Democrat and you identify strongly as a Democrat, or if you're a Republican and you identify strongly as a Republican, that commits you to a very narrow, specific, concrete worldview, right? And within that worldview, certain things are black, certain things are white, certain things are good, certain things are bad. And that's just the way that it has to be, right? That is what it means to fully subsume oneself within an ideology. And once you're inside an ideology and you embrace it fully, as he says here, an ideology built on the need to hold the line between myself and what I need to believe in, right? Once you fully commit yourself to an ideological worldview, right, then the reality in front of you has to conform to that ideological worldview, right? And the simplest example of this, as we know, is that if you present information that you believe contradicts or disputes the worldview of your political interlocutor, right? Like you can give them that information, you can give them that great article that proves their whole political position is wrong, and that person can even read it. But what they will not do is be able to read it and actually understand it as contradicting that which they already believe to be true. Because once you're in an ideology, you have a need to hold the line. And you have a need to believe in very specific, concrete things, and nothing can really disabuse you of that. And therefore, when you experience either reality or people or information that contradicts that worldview, you have only one option, which is to dismiss it or to interpret it away so that it's no longer a contradiction, right? And when you're stuck in that kind of position, which you basically can't see reality for what it is, right? That is the concern that Rav Shagar is expressing here. He says, for one who is captured by ideology, the obligatory behavior is derived from this is how it must be, right? Once you're in, right? Like you buy the party line, hook, line, and sinker, right? If you're a real Republican, a real Democrat, right? Like you know what your talking points are. You know what's kosher and what's treif, and that's just the way it has to be. And not because of this is how I am. Meaning, Rav Shagar's point is here is that when you buy into ideology and these deep ideological commitments, it's simply like that's the way it has to be, right? And it doesn't stem from any personal place of looking at the world and coming to your own conclusions, or reflecting on your own experiences and deducing that this is what the meaning of them is for yourself and how you should act in the world. He says it may indeed become a tool of ideology, since it is easy for those in power to exploit this is how it should be for their own needs. Meaning once ideology sets up a set of like sort of absolute commitments and expectations, it's very then easy for it to be abused by power, because power wants to be able to motivate people towards those very specific commitments and expectations. And what could be better than motivating people to certain goals if you know that nothing can really get in the way of nothing can ever convince them otherwise, that those goals are in any way not true. That's a very, very powerful thing to have at your fingertips, right? Utopia, on the other hand, is built on inspiration, on true belief, and not on the need to believe. Right? Ideology presents a set of absolute beliefs that you sort of have to buy into, and those beliefs then are basically imposed on reality. Reality can't deny them because there's only one way the world can be, right? Like, again, this is unfortunately become a key feature of the way American political discourse has become absolutely polarized. But in truth is, you don't have to be a political extremist to be caught within a very narrow ideological frame. Because what Rav Shagar understands is that, again, to a certain extent, we are all caught within ideological frames. Because as I said before, for most of us, our most deeply held commitments, our most deeply held beliefs are not things which reality can contradict. Right? We've even seen this already with Rav Shagar. It takes something truly profound. It takes something maybe to the level of trauma or revelation itself to actually show to us that our ideological worldview has some holes in it or has some contradictions in it. And when an ideological worldview is brought to bear to fully embrace messianism, right? Again, which is about ultimate concerns, then you are playing with fire. And that is the way messianism often expresses itself, is through a profoundly ideological worldview. I'll give you just a simple example of it that Rav Shagar touches on it here. One of the things that the religious Zionism has to deal with, right, is that its belief in messianism was great 100 years ago. It was great 75 years ago. It was great 50 years ago. But how long can you keep telling yourself that Israel is the beginning of the redemption before you have to start asking, well, wait a second, how long do we have to keep waiting for this for? Right? Like how many things have to happen that seemingly negate that possibility before one is willing to question and ask, well, wait a second, maybe redemption is not exactly the right way to look at this, right? This is perhaps even more profound with Chabad, right? With Chabad, even 34 plus years after the Rebbe's death, right? People still believe he's the Mashiach, right? You want to talk about not letting the facts get in the way of your ideology, right? There's probably not a better example than that. Right? Because to believe that a dead man is going to come back to life and be the Messiah, as we know, is not necessarily the most Jewish of ideas. So to be able to hold on to that, again, shows you the profound power of messianic thinking, and the way when it is expressed in an ideological worldview can really trap us to basically, deny reality as it is. And unlike Chabad in America, which functions as an autonomous Jewish group that's basically just concerned about itself and outreach, right? Religious Zionism here in Israel actively takes up in the political discourse, right? There are religious Zionist political parties with platforms, right, that have a lot of influence in the state, in the army, in the culture, and therefore their messianic commitments are not just theory, right? They are real, and they have real stakes to them. And again, if you want to ask yourself, where and how this is true, right? One doesn't have to go very far than look at Israel's current coalition today, right? It is a right-wing coalition. That's the only way to describe it. And some of the most extreme figures within the coalition are the figures who affirm this sort of messianic ideological worldview. And it is very, very clear how their extreme beliefs in many ways stem from this messianic ideological worldview, because again, they have certain commitments and reality has to be a certain way in order to reflect that. And nothing's really going to get in the way of that, right, for them. And that's why, they are quote unquote true believers. At least sometimes that's the way they like to think about themselves, Rav Shagar would argue that messianic ideology is not really about faith at all, right? And we saw this again going back several weeks ago, because if your faith can't fail, if your faith can't be disproven in any way whatsoever by reality, then your faith isn't faith at all. It's an illusion, right? It's something that's fundamentally disconnected from the world. For faith to be real, right, faith actually has to speak to the reality in front of you. It can't deny the reality in front of you. Otherwise, it's not faith. It's a fantasy at that point. So Rav Shagar is deeply concerned with what happens when messianism gets turned into a political platform, a political way of thinking, that it can be violent, that it can be totalitarian, right? It is deeply, deeply problematic for him. And he's already expressing this in the 90s, already even in the 80s to a certain extent. And in that way, he is going against like a major thrust of the religious Zionist community, especially for the people that he is close to, right? Rav Shagar is not necessarily a liberal. So when he offers these critiques, he is in some ways, but he also isn't. And so when he offers these critiques, right, he is in some ways criticizing those who are fairly close to him. He spent time learning at Yeshivat Merkaz Harav, right, the yeshiva founded by Rav Kook and led by Rav Kook's son, right? Like the people that he's criticizing in Gush Emunim are like people he knows intimately well. They aren't like the other side you can point to who are different and extreme. They are like his neighbors. They are his friends. They are the people he was in yeshiva with, right? Like these are people that are close to him, but nonetheless, he can't help but critique what he sees as deeply problematic about their whole messianic way of thinking. Now that essay, as I mentioned, was written in the aftermath of the Gulf War, and you can see his discomfort with political messianism, his attempt to think through an alternative. The second essay I want us to look at, which was written in the months leading up to the Hitnatkut here in Israel, the disengagement from Gaza, and in many ways, Rav Shagar's life was bookended or defined by these sort of tragic historical moments for Israel. That's very significant for Rav Shagar. The first being the Yom Kippur War, right, which is a moment, as we discussed, sort of destroys the fantasy of Israel's invulnerability. And for Rav Shagar, to a certain extent, the fantasy that Israel is absolutely, driving us towards the redemption is itself, the state itself, messianic. And then the second event at the end of his life is the disengagement from Gaza, which he experiences in a very profoundly challenging fashion. And again, what was so difficult about the disengagement was that the authority, the power of the state was being used to basically uproot religious Zionists from their homes, religious Zionists who had committed so much to the state and so much for their belief in the messianic potential and possibility of the state of Israel. And Rav Shagar is particularly bothered by the fact that the state does this in a way that is sort of unilateral and heavy-handed, right? One of the things that Rav Shagar understood, which is prescient and is absolutely connected to our historical moment right now, he saw one of the problems that Hitnatkut. Again, he was ambivalent about it. He could see that there was good in it, but he also saw that there was bad in it. And one of his major problems is the way that Hitnatkut was imposed politically. Right? Sharon did not run on the platform of the Hitnatkut, get elected with a mandate, and then be able to say, okay, the majority chose me to do this. Right? It kind of came after he was already in power. There was no referendum. There was no sort of way to easily say this is the will of the people. And they pushed through the disengagement. And Rav Shagar feels that heavy-handedness actually profoundly alienates the right, who felt they were just like trampled, and that he understands that process is going to have consequences. Because when you act unilaterally to impose your will on the other, right, you can expect that is going to, you might win in the short term, but you may very well lose in the long term. And one of the things that Rav Shagar identifies is that the right's assent and its willingness to impose its will on the center left, in many ways, is still a response to the Hitnatkut. Right, that kind of approach, what you're seeing today with the sort of judicial reform, right, which again is sort of single-handedly being imposed by, not by collective will, but by, in some sense, a minority, right, is in itself just as violent and non-democratic as elements of the Hitnatkut were as well. When Rav Shagar confronts the Hitnatkut, one of the biggest theological questions he has to deal with is, again, this question of messianism, right? We're supposed to be moving forward to redemption. Right? Suddenly we're uprooting settlements, right? We're pulling back, right? The state is showing its violent face, maybe its true face to us. Can we still commit ourselves to a belief in redemption after this, traumatic experience, particularly for religious Zionism. And that's the question that Rav Shagar is dealing with in this second essay. What is fascinating is, yet again, we see with Rav Shagar that even when reality confronts or contradicts his beliefs, right, he doesn't abandon the beliefs. Like we saw this with the Yom Kippur War. When his friends die, when he experiences unimaginable trauma, it doesn't lead him to deny his faith. It leads him to have to rethink what faith is all about. And the same is absolutely true here, right? The Hinatkus doesn't cause him to say, okay, we got to give up on the belief in a Messiah, right? Either because history is showing it's not possible, or because we think it's like just too problematic, right? Those are not the options Rav Shagar is willing to go down. But what he does, which is always the much harder option, the more difficult option, and that is trying to rethink the nature of redemption itself. So that it, like faith, could be something that is real and alive in the world that he lives in. So here's what he says. He says, I will bring an example of the necessary change from the case of messianism. We have to rethink messianism, a term that has become vilified in our days. And he realized, like I said, messianism is messy business, right? Like who wants to be known as a messianist if you really understand what that means, right? The religious writer Gush Emanim is accused by various groups of being messianic. One philosopher has already written that radical evil, political totalitarianism, appears when religious faith or insight or democracy itself is viewed as a future present. And when we say it means viewed as a future present, Rav Shagar is referring to, or Slavoj Žižek, who he's citing here, is referring to, is this idea that we already have a vision of the future that we think is absolute. And it's just a question of taking that vision and imposing it on the reality here and now, right? Not that there's different options the future can take, or not that I have a sort of rough idea, but I don't know what form it's going to be, right? The totalitarian dimension, the radical evil of messianism is when you say, this is what it is, and this is how it has to be. And I'm going to make sure it happens right here and now. Because when you think that way and you act that way, right, you are always willing to sacrifice others. Right? It's the very definition of zealotry, right? That you know what God wants, you know what God needs, and it's your job to make it happen. Anybody who doesn't recognize that, well, sorry. Sometimes to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. That's maybe like the most theological, simplistic statements you can make about this kind of messianism. He says, in other words, there is a danger when messianism becomes a political argument, an actual political force. This is the opposite of the faith of the Haredim, in which belief is suspended. Right? He's noticing that again. Like, what's the classic difference between religious Zionism and the Haredi world here in Israel? Religious Zionism thinks the Mashiach or the Messianic age is beginning, redemption is at hand, where the Haredim will argue, no. Israel's not the Mashiach. Israel doesn't mean redemption has come. We're still waiting for that moment. It is far in the future. We can't bring it on ourselves. We can be good Jews here in the land of Israel, but we can't expect or work towards more than that. He says, though one looks forward to redemption, he might come any day. The Mashiach might come any day. One does not understand messianism as having actual meaning. This is the Haredi outlook, right? You believe in Mashiach, right? You pray for Mashiach, right? But you as a Haredi Jew isn't like thinking to themselves on an active daily basis, okay, here's how I'm bringing Mashiach. Like, here's my job. Here's what has to come next, right? For the Haredi Jew, right? Like, again, right? You believe, but your Shabbat, your Shacharis, your Pesach, right? It's going to look like it's always looked for Jews, because that's what a Jew does. We hope for the future, but we know what we're supposed to do in the here and now. Rav Shagar contrasts sort of the Gush Emanim approach, right? This radical political messianism with Haredi, which is again about sort of we just hope and pray, with another approach, that of Yeshayahu Leibovitz, which he calls the sort of radicalized Haredi position. Because what does Yeshayahu Leibovitz say? Famous Zionist thinker, religious in ways, but not religious Zionist in the sense of Rav Kook. Leibovitz offers one of his famous lines, or his expression, that any Messiah who comes is by definition a false Messiah, right? Kol Mashiach Shabahu Mashiach Shel Sheker, right? Any Messiah who comes is by definition a false Messiah. And what Leibovitz is getting at by this is in some ways a secular worldview, one in which redemption is an ideal that we aspire to, but never really fully comes in reality, right? If the Haredim thought the Mashiach will come, but it's not our job, we can't do anything about it, we just hope and wait. Leibovitz takes it a step further and says, you know what? It's an ideal. It's something that motivates us, but it's never actually going to happen. Any Messiah who comes is by definition a false Messiah, right? Jesus claimed to be the Messiah. Well, we know he was a false Messiah. Bar Kochba claimed to be the Messiah. We know he's a false Messiah. We can go down the list, right? State of Israel comes. Well, Leibovitz would say, we know it's a false Messiah. Anyone that comes, right? No matter how accurate it might attempt to appear, right, is ultimately false because in a sense, it's only an ideal that we can aspire to. Anybody who tries to make it a reality is fundamentally engaged in either deception or error. He says, but in opposition to his position, to Leibovitz, the Haredi position believes that the Mashiach will come, but through a miracle, right? What the difference, again, between Leibovitz and the Haredim is that the Haredim do believe in Mashiach. We can't do anything to really make it happen. But if and when and how Mashiach will come, it will be miraculous. Right? Intensifying this position doesn't mean that messianism must be relegated to the realm of prayer, to the place of yearning, and its activism uprooted completely as their Haredim thing. In this discussion, where he's presented three options, the Gush Emanim option, and the Leibovitz option, both of those are extremes that Rav Shagar rejects. He rejects the messianism that says it's already here, it's our job, here's how we make it happen, go settle that hill over there, hold it, right? Like affirm a very clear eschatological vision that we're making happen right now, right? That's one extreme Rav Shagar rejects. He also rejects the Leibovitz extreme, which says, Al Mashiach Shabbat, Mashiach Shel Sheker, right? Anybody who comes claiming redemption is at hand is essentially deceiving you. It's a lie. It's false. It's an ideal we aspire to. It's not really going to happen. He rejects both of those extremes. The path that he wants to follow here is in some ways he identifies with the Haredi path, in which we don't give up on redemption, right? But at the same time, we don't think redemption is right here, right now, or that here are the steps that we have to take and then redemption will happen. But at the same time, he doesn't really quite love the Haredi view. Because the Haredi view is one of ultimately a passivity, right? When Gershom Shalom describes the traditional, we'll say, Haredi view of redemption, he describes it as living a life in deferment, right? Because the future, the redemption, what you're really hoping for, right, is always beyond. It's always out there, but not here. And Rav Shagar finds that to be a little too passive. Like he's still a Zionist, right? Zionists are not willing just to sit around and pray and leave it at that. So the question is, what can there be a messianism in the Haredi spirit that is, again, neither political like Gush Emanim, nor again abandons the idea entirely as being real like Leibovitz. So to develop this, he turns to two German Jewish thinkers, Walter Benjamin and Franz Rosenzweig, who are both contemporaries in the early 20th century. Both Benjamin and Rosenzweig are radical and profound Jewish thinkers. Neither one is religious in any traditional sense for the most part, though Rosenzweig becomes religious. He certainly doesn't grow up that way. But what makes Benjamin and Rosenzweig fascinating for Rav Shagar and for me personally is the way they mix together theology and philosophy. Both of them use theology because they realize that it conveys philosophical ideas that traditional philosophy doesn't really make a space for. And both of them recognize that to sort of understand the world philosophy, you actually need theology and some of the theological truths and claims that theology makes to be able to even recognize how philosophy can really show us or teach us anything that is of worth. And there's a radicality to both Benjamin and Rosenzweig that one does not find in sort of the traditional Jewish liberal thinkers of the 20th century. They're both thinkers. And again, what's Benjamin and Rosenzweig's radicality? Part of it is the belief in redemption, and not a redemption that is forever deferred, but a redemption that is in some ways more imminent, right? Your typical 20th century Jewish thinker, let's take like Rav Soloveitchik, for example, right? Like he's much more in this sort of Haredi camp of redemption is like, out there somewhere, right? And Rav Soloveitchik, to his credit, is not trying to translate redemption into a political platform. But that in its own isn't really sufficient for Rav Shagar. And what he appreciates about the radicalism of Benjamin and Rosenzweig is they point us to a way in which redemption can be more imminent, but it is not a political redemption. It's not political messianism. For both Benjamin and Rosenzweig, it is much more of a messianic consciousness that one cultivates or aspires to or anticipates in the here and now, that in itself has political consequences, just not political in the way that we typically think about it. So I want to just give you a little bit from Benjamin, and then we'll see how Rav Shagar understands him, and then Rosenzweig and how Rav Shagar applies it. So with Walter Benjamin, Walter Benjamin writes the Theses on the Philosophy of History. I want to say it's either 39 or 40 or 40, maybe it was like 41 or something. He's a German Jew, right? He tries to flee when the Nazis rise to power. And as he is fleeing, right, like he is basically trying to make sense of the world and how the world is falling apart. And one of the last things he writes are these Theses on the Philosophy of History, which again are sort of like radical, philosophical, almost mystical conclusions that are Marxist. I mean, this is his very fully in his Marxist mode, but one in which the theological implications of Judaism are very important for understanding, like for a Marxist understanding of the world, for a materialist understanding of the world. And in these, he's very much drawn to the idea of redemption. He writes these like literally very closely before he dies, and they're very profound. And one of the ideas that he keeps coming back to is that revolution, the Marxist idea of revolution, can really only be understood through the Jewish lens of redemption. That without the Jewish lens of redemption, revolution doesn't really make sense, but not in sort of the mystical, miraculous sense either. So we have to understand what he means. So he talks about this in multiple places in this like sort of fragments of the essay. But the core idea I want to just focus on right now is the way in which he describes how revolution is always a rupture. Revolution is a rupture of the status quo, right? We think the world works a certain way, and then revolution comes and literally turns it upside down. And it means starting from scratch. And that moment of rupture, that moment of turning the world upside down, starting from scratch, is a profoundly radical moment. It's also a profoundly terrifying moment, right? Because when everything you know suddenly gets wiped away to usher in something new, right? There's something profoundly anxiety-provoking about that, profoundly terrifying about that. And what he talks about here, and it's fascinating again, just because Pesach is coming, it's deeply, again, you'll be able to pick up on the Jewish resonance here very quickly, right? What he points out is that revolution is always connected to time, right? A revolution begins with the disruption of time. It begins with the disruption of clock time, and it ushers in a new calendar time. So like, what does that mean? Well, clock time is to a certain extent homogeneous, right? If you have a clock, right, like the old clocks with the hands on them, right, they just keep going round and round. There's no real way to differentiate one day from the next by looking at a clock, right? It's just sort of universal, abstract, right? You're stuck in the rat wheel of time, goes on and on and on and on. No way to really know yesterday from tomorrow, right? The calendar, however, always has a historical sense to it. And what Benjamin wants to argue is that revolution, which is really for him redemption, he says it here, is a break in the way that we think about time. It's a fundamental new beginning. And part of the reason this is so fascinating is that he argues that revolution and redemption means a break in clock time and the beginning of a new calendar time. So where do we see this? Well, we see this in the Exodus from Egypt. Right? The Exodus from Egypt ushers in a fundamentally new calendar for the Jewish people. Right? What's the first day of the calendar? Right? It's Rosh Chodesh Nisan, right? Nisan, the month in which the Jewish people leave Egypt, is today, right? Or the day in which, the month in which the Jewish people leave Egypt, that begins the new calendar. That is the rupture. That is the new beginning, right? Nisan is the month of miracles. It's the month of the plagues. It's the month in which they leave Egypt. It's the month of Kriyat Yam Suf, right? This is the miraculous moment of rupture, which ushers in a new possibility of time. And what Benjamin also points out here, as I said, there's a disruption of clock time, right? Clock time is that ambiguous, homogeneous time that just feels like you're on a rat wheel doing the same thing over and over again, right? Tomorrow, yesterday, today, it's all one and the same. So he talks about how the Second French Revolution in 1830, it's called the July Revolution. He points how one of the things the revolutionaries did is they shot out the clocks, right? They shot out the clocks because you have to sort of disrupt time in sort of its continual arbitrary repetition in order to make a break for something new. And he points out here, the shooting out of the clocks is like the miraculous rupture moment of Yeshua stopping the sun in the sky, right? That's the miracle he does when the Jewish people are fighting. He stops the sun, right? It's a moment of rupture. It's a moment of revolution. It's a moment of transformation. And what Rav Shagar wants to argue is that messianism, the way he wants to think about it, is holding the space open for that rupture, holding the space open for the possibility that the way the world is now is not the way the world is always going to be. We think things that are around us are going to last forever. We think we're going to last forever, right? A true belief in messianism is a recognition that however the world looks right now, everything could change. Everything could change tomorrow. Everything could even change maybe in the next 5 minutes, right? And when you live with that kind of awareness, right, that fundamentally transforms who you are as a political actor in the world. So let me just read a little bit here. As the modern philosopher Walter Benjamin expressed well, messianism as a miracle, because it's a rupture. A miracle is always a rupture. It's a new beginning, right? What's perhaps the most miraculous new beginning that we all experience? Well, it's the new beginning of birth, right? Every birth is in some sense a miracle because we get something new that never existed in the world before. And of course, every birth, every labor is painful and difficult and scary. And you're not even sure whether the mother and the child are going to survive, right? And if you've ever been a parent, right, that very first birth of your first child, right, like you are never the same after that. Like that, in some ways, at least for me, was like the most transformative moment of my life. Getting married was very big, but having my first child, that one, it was like the world was overturned for me. I was never the same. I was never the same again, right? So as the modern philosopher Walter Benjamin expressed well, messianism as a miracle can be understood as a revolution and not as a process as is understood by the Enlightenment. So here's the thing, if revolution is a miracle, if redemption is a miracle, you can't prepare for it. You can't take steps to make it happen. All you can do is open yourself up to the possibility of it. Right? This is because it is unable of truly giving birth to something new. The Enlightenment, with its emphasis on progress, right, that we can make tomorrow a little better than today, right? Like, I want our children to have a little better world than the one we have, right? That's not messianic thinking. Doesn't reflect a belief in redemption, right? Because that's just a little more of what we know right now, right? That kind of approach can only recycle the old and return it to itself. Leibovitz made it eternal, the gap in the duality between the physical and the spiritual. Remember, Leibovitz said Mashiach's never coming, redemption's never coming. He rejected, of course, this possibility because he thought that the objective laws of nature indisputably rule reality. Right? Leibovitz thought there's no miracles. Like, there's laws of nature, and you have to live with that. You have to live with those constraints. But Rav Shagar notes, and this goes back to what we saw before with Rav Shagar, the great innovation of messianism, that which the great prophets preach so enthusiastically, is rooted exactly in this, that the gap is not absolute, and that the Mashiach will bridge between the objective and the subjective. He will come. Messianism as a utopian echo that acts upon us and inspires us must continue to provide spirit for those who interpret faith. Messianism is indeed a revolution, a refusal, the place in which the desire of the subject bumps into historical laws. What he means here is that the desire of a human being in the messianic anticipation causes us to recognize that all these things we think are important, all these things that we think are of ultimate significance, are ultimately, again, like temporary, passing, transient, right? That there's an ultimate reality and a rupture that brings forth that ultimate reality that will remind us and show us how everything that we think is God is really not. Right? Like that is the revolutionary consciousness that we have to hold open to. And the reason this is so significant, and I'll say it again with Rosenzweig, is that the number one thing that often prevents us from being able to change the world radically in the way that we claim that we want it to be is our very investment in the status quo as it is. Like, we say we want a transformed world, we say we want a radically better world, but usually we just want the world as it is, maybe a little bit better for us, right? And it's our investment in the way things are, because in many ways we're terrified about what a radical transformation might be, that causes us to do basically all that we can to keep things the way that they are, right? Radical transformation is not something human beings run towards. Radical transformation is something human beings fight with every fiber of their being. And messianic consciousness, a true belief in redemption, a hope for redemption, to pray for redemption, means being open to the possibility of the impossible. It means recognizing that those things you think are of ultimate importance and your investment in them is far deeper than you want to acknowledge, are really, again, transient and passing, that there is something more. And giving up the way things are to recognize there is truly something more, it's not something human beings do very often. Remember I said before, right? What's the greatest miracle of redemption? It's that human beings might actually be different. And part of that difference, part of that true revolutionary consciousness means a willingness to, again, like embrace something more than what is, right? To be willing to work against your own self-interest towards that radical otherness that you believe can and should and must be. He says, unlike the Haredi community, Leibovitz's position that we have described is not possible for the religious Zionist community. Religious Zionism is still committed to Mashiach, some idea of redemption. We can't just get rid of it like Leibovitz did. Without messianism, there can be no religious Zionism, just as there cannot be Zionism. A utopian pathos is an essential part of it to fix the world. For Rav Shagar, even secular Zionism is messianic, right? And he's correct. If you look at the history of Zionism, even secular Zionism, right, it is basically a secularized messianic ethos, right? Ben Gurion's writings are full of like messianic anticipation, secularized messianic anticipation. So Zionism, even in its secular form, it has messianism, that utopian aspiration as part of it. We can't just get rid of Mashiach, of redemption, if you're Jews, certainly if you're a Zionist, right? Like maybe the essence of Zionism is a return to Zion, right? Jews are only supposed to do that at the end of days. The Jewish return to Zion is like what we see as redemptive, right? So you cannot be a Zionist and on some level just say you're going to get rid of redemption. It just doesn't work. But how is it possible to resolve this insight with the previous one, that messianism as a future present is evil, right? So for Benjamin, and the way Rosenzweig wants to use it, it is holding open that possibility of revolution, of rupture, of transformation. Remember how hard it was for the Jews to really leave Egypt. So like we think of it in hindsight, of course they wanted to leave. They saw the miracles, right? Like it was obvious, like there was a better world waiting for them. But don't you remember what happens to the Jewish people just 7 days later? They leave Egypt. They find themselves at the Red Sea, right? The sea is at their front, and Paro and his army is at their backs, right? The Jewish people have gone from that proverbial, between a rock and a hard place, out of the frying pan and into the fire. And what do they do at that moment? They turn to Moshe and they say to him, were there not enough graves for us in Egypt that you had to take us out to the desert here to die, right? That is the way human beings typically look at radical change, right? They look at it as death, right? They look at it as like, bring us back to the way bad things used to be. Because I'm not willing to risk, I'm not willing to jump into the Red Sea in order for it to split, right? That's not something human beings are willing to do for the most part. We'd rather go back to Egypt. We'd rather go back to slavery and oppression and an unredeemed world, right? It's a real challenge here to hold open that space for messianic conscience, for messianic yearning. And I'll conclude by showing how Rav Shagar draws on this for Rosenzweig. I know we're a minute or two over, but I'll just try to finish here. Rosenzweig has a very similar notion to redemption as Benjamin. Rosenzweig actually influences Benjamin. He writes earlier than Benjamin, a little bit earlier than Benjamin. Benjamin reads Rosenzweig. And for Rosenzweig, redemption is, again, sort of the core engine of Judaism, right? He writes the star of redemption. You don't put redemption in the title of your magnum opus unless it's important to you philosophically and theologically. Rosenzweig's understanding of redemption is such that we have to, at a certain level, recognize it is always not yet, right? It is something we believe can happen and will happen, but most of the time, maybe nearly all the time, we also have to recognize that it is not yet. We pray for redemption. We believe redemption is possible. We believe redemption can be today, not even tomorrow, but today. But at the same time, when we finish those prayers and we see Mashiach hasn't come, we have to recognize that it is not yet. And what Rosenzweig expresses and what Shagar is really drawn to, and he sees this as being relevant to religious Zionism, is that religious Zionism can pray and hope and dream for Mashiach with every fiber of its being, and living in the land of Israel makes that even so much more real for us, right? To live in the land of Israel is to experience God in a way unlike anywhere else, right? You're walking on the stones in the hills where our ancestors walked. Like I can just, walk for 15 minutes and see the Temple Mount practically from where I live, from a hill overlooking it, right? Like this is a place in which you can feel that God is just beyond the horizon, that redemption is just beyond the horizon. So it is a place that inspires great messianic yearning and hope. And we have to hold on to that. And we need that to be an engine for us. But at the same time, we also have to be able to recognize, as Rosenzweig says, that it is still not yet, right? We have to hold out hope and belief it can be today, but also recognize that until Mashiach comes, it's not yet. Rav Shagar says here, messianism is not a political argument, but it can be the spirit that animates politics, the vision that stands at its base. It is never a present, but rather a future that we yearn and aim for, right? For Rav Shagar, right, the belief in redemption, the belief in Mashiach transforms the way we think about the world that we're in. I'll conclude with this. I remember the first time that somebody told me, a very religious Jew who I looked up to, that they had a bag packed for when Mashiach was going to come. Right? They had a bag packed under the bed for when Mashiach was going to come, so they were going to be ready to go and be out the door. By the way, this is like almost like a traditional Jewish idea. There are multiple stories in Jewish history of Jews preparing to have everything they need so that when Mashiach comes, they really are ready to go. There's historical examples of this. Gluckle of Hamlin, famous Jewish woman who writes a memoir autobiography in the 17th century. When the Jews in her town hear about Shabtai Tzvi, they are already starting to prepare for Mashiach. They prepare barrels of food so that they're literally ready to go the moment that the final word is clear that redemption has begun. They've got like barrels ready. And it's actually depressing for them because at a certain point they realize Shabtai Tzvi is not the Mashiach. And there's like, should we open up the barrels of food and start eating it? Because we know like redemption's not really here, right? There's something profoundly heartbreaking about that moment for them. But again, there's this idea we should be ready. And I remember when my friend, this religious role model, said he's got a bag packed. Part of me was like, he's crazy. Like, who the hell's got a bag packed for Mashiach? Like this is something we pray for, we hope for. It's not really going to happen. Why would you have a bag packed for it? And it kind of shook me. But what that act of having your bag packed represents is that already in the here and now, you feel the visceral reality that redemption will come, must come. And as such, you are ready for it. And why that is significant politically is instead of saying the structures, the truths that orient our world in the here and now are absolute, right? Like, I'm a Democrat, I am a Republican, that's the truth. I'm a Likudnik, I believe in the reform, I'm against the reform, right? Whatever your political ideology is, instead of thinking that is like absolute truth, Sinai, when you got your backpack for Mashiach, it is a constant reminder that though you live in a world that presents itself as absolute, that world is ultimately transient, right? That there is a radical rupture and revolution that is just waiting to come. And when you realize that there is a radical rupture and revolution that is just waiting to come, it enables you not to look at the world through those ideological eyes that fix it and put it in stasis and make it black and white, make it rigid and unchanging, and make it full of profound conflict and animus. Rav Shagar himself was a supporter of social justice in the sense that he saw it as reflecting as our messianic yearnings, that we want a better world. We deserve a better world, and we must hold open the possibility of that. And I'll just conclude with this. He says, when we ask ourselves if we should join with one social protest movement or another, we must ask if the movement merely partakes in the twisted rules of the same corrupt game, or if it really aims at actual change. When we go out there to try to change the world, if we're just trying to make it 5 or 10% better, that's maybe not a bad thing, but it's not what we should ultimately be aspiring to. Some social protest movements call for change, but a change still within the assumption and rules of the existing consensus. Just want things to be a little better, right? What's wrong with that? However, right, the Jewish belief in redemption is an aspiration for something more that we want to feel in the here and now, already feel pulled towards in the here and now. We hope for a more radical change. It is a change in the rules of the game itself, a new orientation, a new direction. This is because our justice, Jewish justice as it were, compels a society of intimate connection and not one of man is wolf to man, even if the wolves are tied up and restrained by the chains of the law. Right? What we hope for is not a world in which the political arrangements of Israel are better and we're not so conflictual, right? So we're not always going at it with each other. What we yearn for is a redeemed world. It doesn't look like this one. It's not the state in any way that we can typically understand it, because states are human and redemption is divine. And we have to hold ourselves open to that rupture and revolutionary possibility of God, right? It's what faith is all about for Rav Shagar. And holding that space open for it, right? To feel bound by covenant, to say this is something we don't just hope is true, but know is true and feel pulled towards it in the here and now. That's what it means to be a Jew. And that belief in redemption also means that we're not going to fall into the traps of the political ideologies of others, to those zero-sum games that deny reality. We know that there is so much more, and we have to be open to that radical possibility. I want to thank everyone for all these classes. I know I went a few minutes over, a little bit over. I appreciate your patience, and if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm happy to take a few minutes here.
Okay, thank you. Chaim, go ahead.
I was actually most interested in Rabbunim, Simcha Bunim concept, because in many ways, to me, that's the most radical change of consciousness. I think that to me is the meaning of Mitzapim Liyeshua. In other words, it's the constant being aware of letatarmine, that God is always there, and I find that far more compelling, in a sense, that the redemption is always going on in a sense. We just don't hear it or see it. It's this, like the famous Sfat Emet, that when God said Lech Lecha to Abraham, he's saying it all the time. It's just Abraham happened to be hearing it, or creation is going on all the time. It's just that we don't see it. And so Mitzapim Yeshua is that radical consciousness, which is ongoing. I think, to me, that's the Hasidic approach that is far more appealing.
So look, I hear that. Here's the thing. I'm not a mystic. So I don't know what it means to see like the world is miraculous, not in a mystical sense, because I'm not a mystic. I don't have those kinds of experiences. That's not the way I look at the world. The world has rules and I experience it that way. Right. So in that sense, I struggle, a bit. What we can be open to are the moments of rupture, right? Chassidut imagines a sort of constant and continuous, like consciousness awareness of a hidden reality. I'm not sure that's possible, but what Benjamin and Rosenzweig point us to is the possibility of rupture and redemption. And we all experience moments of rupture. They're not continuous. That's the whole definition of rupture. Can't be continuous, right? The clock only stops. The calendar only starts again once. It's only one Yitziat Mitzrayim, right? Moments of rupture, like falling in love, like having your first child, like confronting death of somebody you love. They don't happen very often in your life, but they reveal sort of the excess of what is, and shows you that there's more. What's important to me, I think, for Rav Shagar, and certainly Rosenzweig says this as well, is that it's not that redemption means I experience it in the here and now. It's Piety Yeshua is an anticipation, right? And it's the anticipation of it, the belief in it, that it can be here, even if it's not here, which is not a mystical experience, right? Because desire is not mystical. It's that I feel it pulling me, but it's still not here, right? Like that is a very powerful experience because it enables us to step out of the political structures and ideologies that so often contain us, constrain us in ways that we can't understand. So the possibility of rupture and being able to orient ourselves to the possibility of rupture, that I think is very, 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 very critical. I'm envious of people who have sort of, like you said, the Hasidic sort of seeing the deeper, divine layer of reality. There's a certain poetry to that, which I kind of buy into. But I also know, like, I don't spend most of my day writing poetry as much as I love it. Like, we live in a world that is very material, and we have to kind of be willing to acknowledge that on a certain level. And that's where I'm very Rav Shagarian. I want my experience of the world to match my theology. I don't want to live in the sort of poetry is something you read once in a while, or even a lot, but it can't be a continuous experience. And that's where I'm coming from, at least. But I deeply aspire to what you're saying. Any other questions or comments?
So we actually we need to end now.
We're getting kicked out.
Would you like to put your email in the? I mean, you don't have to, but if you'd like to follow.
Yeah, well, always fine. It's Truboff at Gmail.
So Rabbi Truboff is putting his email in the chat now, and I'm sorry that we need to end, but thank you so much, Rabbi Truboff, for such a fabulous full session, not just for today's class. And thank you so much to everyone else who always joins us for learning. While this was our last session together, there's always more to come. So please check our website at drisha.org. And I see Rabbi Truboff's email in the chat now. So we are all good. Thank you so much, everyone.
And God willing, we'll have this opportunity to learn together in the future. Thank you.